welcome everyone, and a special welcome to our international guest speaker all the way from the UK, Mark Newbrook. I'll introduce Mark shortly. Just quickly remind everyone about the topic and the description, just so that we've got the context before Mark starts talking. So, Wittgenstein, two philosophers in one. Mark will present a linguist's take. Ludwig Wittgenstein was an Austrian-British philosopher who taught and worked at Cambridge between 1912 and 1947. He is regarded as one of the leading philosophers of the 20th century, noted for having adopted two very different philosophical stances in his time. Wittgenstein worked primarily in logic and the philosophy of language, with an especial focus on language and the world, and secondarily in the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of mathematics, and the philosophy of religion. Mark will present a linguist's take on Wittgenstein's career and consider questions about language, thought, and reality from Wittgenstein's two phases referred to as W1 and W2. The early Wittgenstein, W1, was concerned with the logical relationships between propositions and the world. The later Wittgenstein, W2, held that the meaning of words is best understood as their use within a given language game. Can we really grasp the nature of reality in some kind of objective way, as W1 claimed, or do our linguistic structures determine thought, including our view of the structures of reality, and thus we cannot grasp the nature of reality in an objective way, as W2 argued? We're thrilled to have Mark Newbrook with us tonight. Born in 1956, and he grew up on the Wirral near Liverpool. He took a BA Honours in Classics, including Ancient and Modern Philosophy and General and Historical Linguistics at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, then an MA and a PhD in Linguistics at Reading University. Mark's dissertation was in the field of quantitative dialectology and associated attitudinal matters. From 1982 to 2003, Mark was a lecturer and researcher in linguistics in Singapore, Hong Kong, Perth, and Melbourne. Apart from dialectology and historical linguistics, he has worked on semantics, English grammar, and phonology, and latterly, combining his linguistics with his broad-based interest in skepticism, on skeptical linguistics, becoming the linguistics consultant to Australian skeptics and now to the two main British skeptical organisations. Among his many publications, Mark has authored Strange Linguistics, which is a book published in 2013, the first ever book-length critical survey work on fringe ideas about language. Mark currently lives in the English Lake District with his partner. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Over to you.
As has been pointed out, I am a linguist, and this is, as Akiba said, a linguist's take on Wittgenstein. So many of you will know more than I do probably about Wittgenstein as a philosopher, but I may be able to introduce something new by way of my linguistic take, my linguistic angle on it. Unfortunately, there are too few people who know both disciplines well, and this keeps coming up again and again. For example, I once made a comment which turned out to be totally false, but not many philosophers had challenged the basis of Chomskyan linguistics. And someone pointed out to me, there's a huge list of papers that do that, of which I was unaware, simply through being a professional linguist rather than a professional philosopher. And in those pre-web days, it was easy to miss stuff. It's easier now to find stuff. But it remains the case that not very many people know both subjects well. I used to go to a philosophy group where people denied the relevance of linguistics or indeed language to philosophical concerns. I've talked to linguists who are not very interested in philosophy and know very little about it. So I think it wouldn't be bad for there to be more interaction between the two disciplines, and there'd be people who could do this better than me, but I'd like to make a little contribution. So we've heard about the career of Wittgenstein in general terms. He did operate mainly in Cambridge. At one point, he spent a little time in Vienna with the Vienna Circle. People may know of Carnap, and they may know of Alfred Eyre, who did some of his early training as a philosopher in the Vienna Circle. He spent a bit of time back in Austria, but he had a peculiar career. He hardly published anything in his lifetime. He published a Tractatus, which is only 75 pages. He published one article, one book review, and a dictionary for children. The other major publication was after his death, Philosophical Investigations. That's what we've already heard, basically. The material in W2, which became Philosophical Investigations, was published only posthumously, although he had a group, 2 volumes of notes of what became Philosophical Investigations, and they were later published in 1958 as preliminary studies for the Philosophical Investigations. He is known for the difficulty experienced by many commentators in penetrating some of his often tersely expressed comments. Many people find him pretty obscure, particularly the Tractatus, which is very short, as I said, and it's full of very aphoristic statements organized hierarchically. Now, there is a good introduction, it's now quite old, by David Pearce in the Fontana Modern Masters series. I think it's still a good introduction to Wittgenstein, but Pearce does too readily, I think, accept some of Wittgenstein's conclusions, particularly W2. He talks as if by the end of his life, Wittgenstein had basically got it. So we'll say things like, Wittgenstein realized blah, 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 which implies that he was right in saying that. It's not presented as a matter for conjecture or further consideration. I still think it's a good book. There's a good, largely non-philosophical account of Wittgenstein and his fascinating but blighted family in a book called The House of Wittgenstein, and I will pass on details of that to anyone who is interested. Some of his family committed suicide. Most of them had mental health problems one way or another. They were not a totally thriving family. And he himself was arguably very eccentric in certain ways. For example, he wouldn't let you miss a class. If you missed one class, even though for apparently a good reason, he would threaten to expel you from the whole group and be very cross with you indeed. He studied mechanical engineering in Berlin, and then he moved on to Manchester, although it's not clear to me how he studied anything in Manchester, because apparently his English was pretty incoherent at that stage. But he was recommended by Gottlob Frege to go to Cambridge and study with Bertrand Russell. And apparently, he more or less burst into Russell's premises without advance warning and demanded to study and work with Russell. Russell hardly knew who he was. And he rapidly acculturated. Russell said that Wittgenstein was the most perfect example he'd ever known of genius as traditionally conceived. Passionate, profound, intense, and dominating. But he thought that W1 was much better than W2. Russell didn't have much time for W2. He thought Wittgenstein had taken a wrong turn at that point. Wittgenstein did all kinds of other things. During the war, he worked as a porter in Guy's Hospital in London, where the Shard is now. There's a little plaque there saying about this. He was a very strange and complex and interesting man, and I'm sure there's plenty that we still don't know about Wittgenstein's life that would be of some interest. Okay, so there we have a very brief statement of the 2 positions that Wittgenstein adopted during his life. Yeah, and as we've heard, W1 was concerned with the logical relationships between propositions and the world. He thought that the world was expressed well through language, and that by attending to the logical relationships within language and between language and non-linguistic entities, you could come to a better perception of how the world actually worked. W1 and W2 did agree. There are common threads, that language has limits imposed by its structures, and that therefore so does thought. But W2 took the view that the meaning of words is best understood as their use within a given language game. I'll return to that. And therefore, you couldn't regard the meanings or the grammar of items in language as a reliable indication of the nature of the external world. It was a very different perception of the relationship between language and the world. You might, for example, play a different language game and thereby come to a very different formulation of what you were talking about. Now, these common threads, that language has limits imposed by its structures, and therefore so does thought. And these relate to the ideas of the very prominent linguist, Noam Chomsky. Now, Noam Chomsky only started publishing after Wittgenstein's death. He started publishing in 1957 when he was only 29 and had a huge impact on the linguistic world. And the idea that there are limits to language and that we cannot really think certain things or say them in language because they don't fit with the limits imposed genetically by the nature of human language, fits in quite well with the idea of the later Wittgenstein, in particular, that your way of talking about the world can only be understood within certain language games, so-called. It doesn't have any general validity, and if you want to say something which is outside your language games, there's no game suitable. You're not able to say it, or not in a coherent way anyway. But the other feature about Chomsky, which relates to Wittgenstein, relates more to W1. W1 anticipated Chomsky's universalism. Part of Chomskyan linguistics is that all languages have an underlying common structure. It's of a very abstract nature. It consists typically or mostly of restrictions on what can and cannot be done in language, what types of grammatical structure occur, what will never occur, even though they can be understood, but they will never actually occur in a human language. Chomsky was talking mainly about grammatical structures. W1 is more concerned with logical structures, but there are links between logical structures and grammatical structures. So although their focus is different, there is that relationship between W1 and Chomsky in that respect. W2 was non-universalistic because W2 involves the idea that differences between linguistic forms reflect deep differences. You may be playing a different game, or you may be speaking a language with a very different structure anyway. There are few linguistic universals. You can't easily say this is something which applies to all languages or even to all varieties of the same language. Now, this has been a big thing in linguistics. You get, for example, people like Sapir and Worf, the two great American linguists of the mid-20th century, before Chomsky, and they argued that languages can be really very different indeed. The differences run deep. There's very little universal. And another language that you start to study might be completely different from any other language that you have ever studied. And the thinking of people who are native speakers of that other language might be totally different from the thinking of people who speak the languages with which you are more familiar. And this was researched very heavily. It could have become a bigger deal, but both Sapir and Worf died young. If they'd lived to a normal age and continued to be professional linguists, but even without them, they had a huge influence, and they had an influence outside linguistics. For example, Benjamin Lee Worf corresponded with George Orwell, and Newspeak in 1984 owes a lot to Worf's thought. Worf himself wrote an unpublished fantasy novel along the same kind of lines. And then there are other people like Jack Vance, the science fiction writer, who wrote a book called The Languages of Pow, which is based on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this had enormous influence, even though the two main men involved died young. And there's been quite a conflict between their view of things and the Chomskyan universalizing view of things within linguistics. So W1 suggests that awareness of genuine structures in the real world generates the most significant features of thought and thus of language. But W2 adopted what's almost the reverse view. Linguistic structures determine thought, including our view of the structure of reality. And therefore, our view of the structure of reality has no independent grounding. It can't be treated as especially significant or authoritative. We can't claim to have access to ideas about the genuine structure of the world, or at least we can't do so through language. Therefore, languages cannot reliably inform us about the world, and therefore W1, according to W2, had succumbed, like most other 19th and 20th century analytical philosophy, to the enchantment of believing that we can really grasp the nature of reality in some kind of objective way, chiefly, according to analytical philosophers, by analyzing the linguistic forms used to express propositions. Now, I've busied myself with this to some degree because I've taken an interest in the fact that there are bigger differences between languages in this respect than some people realize. So, for example, you may take a particular structure in a language, for example, in English, and you may say, oh, that's philosophically interesting. It suggests that there is something that one could get from that about the metaphysical nature of the world. So I once came upon someone who was fascinated by the fact that a sentence in English, like, I don't think it's going to rain, normally means I think it's not going to rain. It doesn't mean I have no opinion about the matter. It means I actually think it's not going to rain. But the negative is attached to the word think, not to the word rain. And someone was in a really confused state once about that and trying to ascribe philosophical significance to that. But then I pointed out that in ancient Greek, that happens not with the verb think, but with the verb say. There's a famous sentence in Xenophon's book about marching back from Persia to Greece. Someone asks someone a question, and the next bit of Greek says, uk epa, he didn't say. But it doesn't mean he didn't say. It means he said that not. Do you know blah, blah, blah? Uk epa, he said he didn't know. But until you know Greek well enough, you're really confused by that, because it looks as if the negative is about him saying, not about him knowing, especially because the verb to know is ellipted and isn't actually there in the sentence. And in some languages, such as Chinese, this phenomenon doesn't happen at all. So the equivalent of I don't think it's going to rain would be I think it's not going to rain. And what I've been trying to argue for some time, and some philosophers don't like this at all, but what I've been trying to argue is that a lot of what might appear to be a philosophical issue really goes back to the structures of particular languages and the way they're used. And if you were starting from a different language, then you would not come to the same view, or you'd be less likely to. And even within linguistics, this can happen. Chomsky grammars, for example, don't like any structure in which the verb and the object are separated from each other. But that's normal in Welsh. If Chomsky had been Welsh, I don't think he would have ever thought of that idea. Because in Welsh, the verb comes at the beginning of the sentence, and then the subject, and then the object. So even within linguistics, this is an issue. But it's particularly an issue where you're trying to extrapolate from the structures of a particular language to information about the nature of the world. And this is the sort of thing that W2 did not like about W1. Even W1 held that some of the most important truths about the world can perhaps be shown. You can give someone an idea of what the truth is, but you can't actually express it concretely in language. So you come to that view by considering lots of cases, for example, but you can't state coherently in language the generality that unites them and constitutes an important truth about the world. W2 held that in many cases, entities or notions which could be thought to be connected by one essential common feature are in fact not connected in that kind of coherent way. They are connected by a series of overlapping similarities or family resemblances where no one feature is common to all. It's like if you have a long piece of string which has been woven out of many individual threads of string, and it forms a coherent whole to a degree, but no one thread runs right through it. Some threads are at this end, some at that end, they overlap, but there's no one thread that runs right through it. There's no one thing that constitutes the whole thing in that coherent way. No one feature is common to all. And Wittgenstein gave as an example games. Now, we use the word game to cover an awful lot of things. Games of chance, like gambling. Games which are very cerebral, like chess, where you sit and stare at a board and work out what to do, how you will beat your opponents. Very physical games like football of various kinds. Children's games. Board games. All kinds of different games. And some of them are very different indeed from each other. It is hard to see what they actually would have in common. They're part of a series of family resemblances, overlapping similarities. And this makes the use of games in philosophizing valid and important, but it means you are making a mistake if you imagine that because A is a game and B is a game, they must have something significant in common, actually in common. Wittgenstein, W2 used this as an analogy for linguistic uses. If you say A and you say B in the same language or in different languages, they may be in the same domain, the same family of ideas, but they may not have anything very specific in common. And you can't derive from the fact that they're both whatever they may be any deep philosophical conclusion. Now, there were two specific language-related issues discussed by Wittgenstein, which a linguist will tend to focus on specifically. One is the claimed impossibility of a private language. There's been a long-running debate about can there be such a thing as a private language where one thinking individual makes up a language on their own, which is not used to communicate with others, very personal, very specific to them. Now, Wittgenstein said this couldn't happen. Clearly, people can make up languages on the basis of languages they already know. Possibly the most famous people of this kind are people like J.R.R. Tolkien, who invented Elvish languages for use in his fiction. But it's quite apparent that they're based on languages that Tolkien already knew. The two main Elvish languages are based on Welsh and on Finnish. How did Tolkien start? He saw trains passing his Birmingham home with Welsh destinations on them. He got interested in the Welsh language. And he learned Welsh, he learned Finnish, he learned other languages, and his Elvish and Dwarvish and other languages are constructed. He was a talented linguist and philologist, Tolkien. He was well able to do this. He didn't start from nothing making up those languages. Then you get people like Zamenhof, who invented Esperanto. Esperanto is the best known of a large number of invented languages, some of which have had quite a lot of success. In the 19th century, there was one called Volapük, which is world speech in Volapük. They once had a conference where even the waiters at dinner spoke Volapük. Esperanto in the end beat Volapük, and many people have learned it, although it is by no means as neutral as people claim. Of course, it's a European-style language. But again, Zamenhof was a native speaker of Polish, and he learned other languages. He didn't make that up from nothing. And the Wittgenstein claim is that it's simply not possible. You don't come to language in that way. And if you'd never learned another language, you would not be able to make up a private language. And even if you make up a language, it will only obtain vitality by being used with others, by being written and spoken and used with others. Without that, it will be a very half-baked, basic thing that even you would not be able to use in a very satisfactory manner. Now, if this is true, if this kind of criticism of the notion of a private language is correct, one issue that arises is how did language start in the first place? There must have been, presumably, a first language. It might have been a rudimentary language at that stage. But if it is not possible for someone to make up a language on their own, there must have been two people at least simultaneously working, developing that first language. And a lot of linguists and philosophers have wondered about this. There is a book called How is Language Possible? By a philosopher called Hathiangadi. I actually met his daughter, who's also a philosopher. And this book is really thick because it's not an easy issue. You can discuss for a long time, how can language possibly exist in the world? How can we use these noises or bits of marks on paper to relate to things in the world or to concepts in our minds? And in particular, how did that start in the first place? So that's one issue. And the second issue is W1 suggests that there might be something of a master language which is used to express logic and semantics, not necessarily to talk about the real world, talk about empirical things in the real world, but to express the core of logic and semantics. And the actual languages draw on that for their logical and semantic components. And this is similar to the Chomskyan notion of mental ease. In Chomskyan linguistics, there is a notion of mental ease, which is very much this, that there is a universal language, which we all inherit through the language acquisition device, which Chomskyans believe we inherit genetically, which is species specific and very largely uniform across the species, very little variation in it. And that provides us with the basic logical and grammatical structure and meaning structure of our language. And then the actual languages we learn are grafted onto that as we mature and become language users. Now, this depends very heavily on a Chomskyan model of how we learn language and how languages are passed on between the generations. And this is very contentious. And I have an extract on mental ease, my ideas about mental ease, which comes from a review I wrote a few years ago of a book by Vivian Evans, who's a very anti-Chomskyan linguist. And he suggests that mental ease is not needed and is not possible. But some Chomskyan linguists say if you don't have that, there's an infinite regress in terms of how you would try to acquire an actual language. You need that as a basis for learning an actual language as a child. It must exist, however peculiar some people may think that is. So I can say more about that if people are interested. There's also, it keeps coming up this. I went to an exhibition a few years ago in the town of Bury, north of Manchester. They have a wonderful art and sculpture gallery there. And they had an exhibition which was basically about reading as art, written language as art. And a lot of it was about these issues involving the relationship between language and the mind. The catalogue on the first page quoted Gustave Flaubert, who said, "Language is like a cracked kettle on which we beat our tunes for bears to dance to, while all the time we long to move the stars to pity." And this is the idea that language is really deficient as a means of talking about the world. And of course it is in many ways lacking. It's far from perfect, but it also has strengths. And the catalogue went on to discuss all this in very postmodernist terms, referring to Jacques Derrida, Julia Kristeva, and other postmodernist thinkers about language. But the Wittgenstein thing kept coming up. The idea was the most important truths cannot be given in language. They can't be discussed in language or expressed in language. And in this particular case, the idea was it's art that will reveal to you those truths which language cannot. Well, people have different views about all this. I once attended a 3-hour lecture by Jacques Derrida, and I got pretty fed up with it. And after 3 hours, I went to someone else's talk. And that person was delighted. "You actually abandoned Derrida to come to my talk." This was at Monash in 1997. And Derrida, I thought it was a dreadful exhibition of vague and unjustified stuff. But that's my take on people like Jacques Derrida. Some people would have a different view. You only have to mention Alain Sokal and these people have a fit. But that's my view. I might be wrong. But it's interesting that in a context like in an art and sculpture gallery, where you wouldn't think this kind of thing would come up particularly, it did come up. It was to do with not only the postmodernists, but also this Wittgensteinian notion that the most important truths about language cannot be expressed, about the world, cannot be expressed in language. They might be shown, but you can't actually handle them in an adequate way in language. It's not adequate for that. Wittgenstein died in 1951, a complex man, to some degree an unfathomable man. Thank you. And I will happily discuss this, take questions, whatever. Thanks very much.
So I want to thank Mark for a really good overview of the two Wittgensteins. I certainly learned a lot. Wittgenstein can be pretty opaque, but I think Mark's done a terrific job in untangling the two Wittgensteins. To access other videos and podcasts in this series, go to the Philosophy Resources section of the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com.